Remember those forgotten cooking tricks big supermarkets never wanted you to learn? They helped families cook smart, waste less, and survive on almost nothing. So why did they quietly disappear? Saving potato peels was not just clever, it was survival dressed up as a snack. In kitchens where nothing was wasted, the peels were scrubbed, sliced into strips, and tossed in leftover grease or oil before being crisped up in the oven or skillet. Some folks added a pinch of salt, while others used paprika or dried herbs to bring them to life. These made a perfectly crunchy side for soups, or even a midday bite on their own. But that was only half the trick. The other half went straight into the stock pot. Peels added depth and starch to broths, soups, and gravies, especially when meat was scarce or completely off the table. It was flavor pulled from scraps, cheap, easy, and resourceful. Families learned that if you boiled them long enough, you got something close to a rustic potato stock. It might not sound fancy, but it added a whole lot of heart to a pot of soup. Today, we throw peels away without a second thought. Back then, you might have gotten a scolding for that. These were the little tricks that made meals stretch further and taste better, and they were far too useful to just disappear. Burying eggs in salt or wood ash sounds like something out of an old pioneer tale, but it was common in American farm kitchens long before refrigeration became standard. People needed a way to make eggs last through the off-seasons, and this was one of the most reliable tricks in the book. You took fresh, unwashed eggs and gently buried them in a box filled with salt or sifted wood ash, making sure they did not touch. The salt pulled out moisture and prevented spoilage, while the ash kept out light and air. Stored properly in a cool pantry or cellar, these eggs could last up to several months. This method might not have made them picture perfect, but they were safe and ready to cook when needed. Scrambled, boiled, or baked into a cake, whatever the dish, having eggs on hand was a gift. It meant no trip to the store and no ration card needed. The supermarkets did not exactly promote this trick. Why would they? If you could store your own eggs year-round, you were not buying theirs. This little pile of salt-covered treasure in the pantry gave families control over their food in ways that are hard to come by now. Stretching meat was a skill every home cook learned whether they wanted to or not. One of the oldest and smartest tricks was mixing cracked wheat or farina into ground beef, pork, or turkey. You boiled the grain just enough to soften it, then folded it into the meat with spices, onion, maybe an egg if you had one. Suddenly, a single pound of meat could feed a family of 5 instead of 3. It showed up in meatloaf, meatballs, patties, and even stuffed vegetables. The grain soaked up flavor, added body, and made the dish feel full without costing extra. It was not about tricking anyone. It was about getting by. Mothers knew exactly how much wheat to add before the texture turned mushy. You learned by doing and by stretching every meal as far as it could go. Grocery stores today sell pre-packed meat stretchers in colorful boxes, but nothing beats the know-how that came straight from your own pantry. These were tricks that helped families survive tight times with a full belly and a little dignity. That is the kind of knowledge that never should have been forgotten. A bowl of ice water sitting on a counter might not look like much, but it saved countless vegetables from the trash. Wilting lettuce, limp celery, droopy carrots, anything that looked sad or lifeless could get a second chance with this trick. All it took was 10 to 20 minutes in cold water, and the fibers would soak up enough moisture to firm back up. Back then, tossing food was not just wasteful, it was unthinkable. You used what you had, and if something could be saved, you saved it. People did not have bags of pre-washed greens or crisp produce at their fingertips. What they had was seasonal, local, and fragile. This soaking trick worked wonders, especially in hot kitchens without air conditioning. It made dinner possible on days when there was nothing fresh left in the house. Even today, grocery chains quietly benefit from you not knowing it. They want you to toss and rebuy. But this simple revival method turned what looked like garbage into tonight's salad, soup base, or sandwich filling. It was not just clever, it was necessary, and it deserves a place in our kitchens again. When milk was just past its prime and starting to sour, you did not throw it away. You turned it into cheese, cottage cheese, farmer's cheese, or a soft spreadable mix. Each version had its own place at the table. The process was simple. Warm the milk, stir in a little vinegar or lemon juice, and let it curdle. Then, drain the curds through a cloth and press lightly until they held their shape. What you were left with was something creamy, tangy, and surprisingly filling. You could spread it on toast, mix it with herbs, or even add it to casseroles and fillings. For people without regular access to store-bought cheese, this was a revelation. It let families create something nourishing and rich from milk that would otherwise go bad. That is the kind of alchemy supermarkets have no interest in reminding you of. After all, if you knew how to make your own cheese, you might skip the dairy aisle altogether. And that quiet independence, the ability to make do with what you had, is exactly the kind of power that deserves to come back. Back before you could buy gravy in a packet or roux in a jar, you had to make it from scratch. That meant browning your own flour. You would pour it into a dry skillet and stir it over medium heat until it turned golden brown, releasing a nutty aroma that meant flavor was on its way. It took time and a bit of practice not to burn it, but the payoff was real. Once cooled, it could be stored in a jar and used to thicken stews, gravies, or creamy casseroles on the fly. This little bit of prep ahead of time made everyday cooking quicker, especially when you had hungry mouths and only 30 minutes to get dinner on the table. Browning flour added richness to even the simplest dishes. No meat? No problem. With a few vegetables and some browned flour, you could still get something satisfying. It is the kind of trick that gives a plain pot of food that slow-cooked flavor without hours of work. But it has faded from our kitchens, probably because supermarkets do not sell it pre-browned. Funny how that works, right? You know those mystery dishes your grandmother used to make? The ones that tasted like home but were never exactly the same twice? Chances are they were hiding leftovers. Whether it was yesterday's roast, a few spoonfuls of vegetables, or that last scoop of mashed potatoes, nothing went to waste. These odds and ends were chopped, seasoned, and folded into pot pies, meat fritters, savory pancakes, or hush puppies. And just like that, you had dinner. These were not glamorous meals, but they were practical, filling, and built on imagination. Grocery stores now sell freezer meals with names like Chef's Surprise, but they are a pale copy of what people used to do on their own. This was food made from food, stretched and reimagined into something new. You never admitted you were serving leftovers, because technically, you were not. You were making something else entirely. Today, we throw out too much because we forgot how to repurpose what is already cooked. These tricks were born from necessity, but carried a kind of quiet pride with them. That is something the big stores never quite understood. Before lemon juice became the go-to, vinegar was the silent hero in every kitchen. A quick dip in diluted vinegar water could keep apple slices, pear wedges, or even peeled potatoes from browning too fast. This was especially handy when prepping ahead of time or packing lunch for school and work. The acid slowed down the oxidation process and bought you a few extra hours of freshness without needing plastic wrap or chemical sprays. For households that only had one apple left for the kids, this trick was worth its weight in gold. It made every bit stretch a little further, taste a little better, and last a little longer. Plus, vinegar was cheaper, more common, and already used for dozens of other kitchen needs: cleaning, pickling, preserving. Grocery stores do not want you to know that a bottle of vinegar can outdo half their produce-saving products. But this tiny trick gave families an edge, especially when the fruit bowl was running low and every slice had to count. It was not just thrifty, it was smart. And it is exactly the kind of thing we should be teaching again. The heel of a loaf of bread, the end piece everyone skips, used to have a starring role. Instead of tossing it out, folks would toast it up and serve it with soup, stews, or beans. It was crunchy, warm, and just enough to soak up the broth. Sometimes it was rubbed with garlic or spread with butter if you were lucky. These end slices were too precious to waste and too useful to ignore. Before store-bought crackers became the default side, toasted bread ends filled the gap. They were simple and satisfying, and made you feel like no part of your meal went forgotten. The best part? They were free. You already had them. That alone made them better than anything wrapped in plastic on a supermarket shelf. This was food born out of thoughtfulness, not packaging. It reminded people that even the smallest scraps had value. It is a quiet kind of wisdom, one that the big food companies would rather you not rediscover. But it is still there, waiting in the bread box. Long before milk was processed, standardized, and stripped of its quirks, it had layers. And if you left it untouched overnight in a glass bottle, the cream would rise to the top. That thick, velvety layer was gold. You could skim it off with a spoon and use it to make butter, whipped toppings, or richer baked goods. The milk below was thinner, yes, but still perfectly fine for drinking or cooking. This trick was part of everyday kitchen life before homogenized milk flattened everything into one uniform texture. People knew how to work with it, how to read its signs, and how to get the most from it. No one waited for a product to be cream-enriched or extra thick. They just used what was already there. Grocery stores moved away from this version of milk on purpose. Less separation means more consistency, longer shelf life, and fewer complaints. But it also meant the end of something more personal, more connected. A quiet act like skimming cream gave families that tiny moment of luxury at home. And we gave it up without realizing what we lost. Grating cold butter into pastry dough may sound like a modern baking hack, but it is older than most kitchen gadgets you will ever own. Before food processors or electric mixers, people used their hands, knives, or box graters to work butter into flour, especially when making pie crusts or biscuits. The trick was to keep the butter as cold as possible so it did not melt into the flour. Grated butter created little pockets in the dough, and when baked, those pockets turned into flake after buttery flake. It made crusts lighter, layers crisper, and the end result far more satisfying. Best of all, it was cheap and easy. No need for a fancy kitchen tool or a prepackaged mix, just butter, a grater, and a little elbow grease. It kept the dough tender, and it gave bakers more control over texture without overworking the mix. Grocery stores have long since replaced this kind of kitchen knowledge with ready-made pie crusts in plastic tubes. But the folks who knew how to do this by hand got results that no store-bought shortcut could match. This was precision, learned in warm kitchens long before appliances did the work. When a block of cheese was almost gone, you did not throw out the rind. You saved it, because that tough edge held the last of the flavor. Hard cheeses like Parmesan or aged cheddar were expensive, and families learned to use every last bit. The rind was dropped into bubbling soup pots or saucepans, where it would slowly soften and melt just enough to release its salty richness. You did not need meat or bones when a single cheese rind could transform a pot of beans or a simple tomato broth. It was thrift that tasted like luxury, and once the rind gave all it could, you fished it out and tossed it, nothing left to offer. Today, cheese rinds get sliced off and tossed in the trash without a second thought, but back then, it was understood that flavor lived in every part of the food. This was one of those quiet tricks that stretched your pantry and made meals feel richer than they were. Supermarkets do not remind you of this one, maybe because it means fewer blocks of cheese in your cart. Roasting a whole onion used to be a meal in itself, simple, hearty, and full of slow-cooked comfort. You did not need olive oil or a rack of spices. Just toss an unpeeled onion into the oven or tuck it into the coals of a fire and wait. Slowly, the inside softened, caramelized, and turned sweet, while the outer skin blackened and protected the flavor. Peel it at the table, sprinkle on salt or butter if you had it, and eat it straight from the foil or plate. For families with barely a potato left, this was a warm, filling side that required nothing but time. Onions were cheap, stored well, and brought out a kind of earthy richness when roasted whole. They could anchor a meal or stretch a small portion of meat. Today, most people roast vegetables in glossy pans with elaborate glazes, but this was bare-bones cooking, and it worked. Grocery stores rarely mention how much flavor lives in the simplest things when left alone. Roasting onions this way was a kind of quiet ritual, one that filled kitchens with warmth and made even a root vegetable feel like something special. Before bacon strips came wrapped in plastic, there was salt pork, hearty, fatty, and packed with flavor. This was the starting point for stews, beans, and slow-cooked greens. You cut off a chunk, diced it small, and rendered it in the bottom of your pot until the fat melted and the bits turned crisp. That salty fat was liquid gold. It coated vegetables and gave every dish a depth that broth alone could not provide. Salt pork kept well without refrigeration, making it a pantry staple in both urban tenements and rural cabins. You might not eat a lot of it at once, but just a spoonful flavored a whole meal. And because it was tougher and less prized than bacon, it was cheaper too. Supermarkets phased it out in favor of neatly packaged bacon slices, but for decades, this was the backbone of American cooking. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable, and it made humble food taste big. Today, most people do not even know what it is. But ask anyone who grew up before the 1950s, and they will tell you, salt pork meant supper was on its way. Boiling cake ingredients together before baking might sound strange now, but it was a kitchen standard back then, especially for spice cakes. You would melt sugar, butter, water, and your spices in a pot until it turned into a thick, fragrant syrup. Then you poured it over flour, added eggs or soda, and baked it. The result? A moist, deeply flavored cake that tasted like it had taken all day, even though it had not. This method saved time, used fewer bowls, and brought out warm notes of cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove. During War and Depression years, when ovens were temperamental and butter was scarce, this kind of cake delivered real joy from very little. There was no need for layers, frostings, or fancy decorations. These were sturdy, honest cakes that sat proudly on the counter and stayed moist for days. Grocery stores eventually sold cake mixes as a shortcut, but this method already was one. It just did not come in a box. It came from memory, muscle, and a saucepan, something supermarkets could never quite package. Before plastic wrap or foil, pies were protected in a different way, by a simple damp cloth. After baking, families would drape a clean, slightly moistened kitchen towel over the pie to keep it from drying out or attracting flies. It was a trick passed down quietly, never written on a box or sold in stores. The cloth kept in moisture, cooled the filling slowly, and even helped the crust stay flaky without getting tough. For households without refrigerators, this was essential. Pies were left on windowsills or countertops, and the cloth did all the work. No packaging, no preservatives, just common sense. And it worked. If someone came by for a slice, you lifted the cloth like a curtain and served it warm. Today, we cover everything in layers of plastic, but back then, the kitchen towel was the only seal you needed. It was clean, reusable, and did not cost a thing. Grocery stores do not sell damp cloths for pie because there is no profit in that, but it is one more forgotten detail from a time when food was made with care and kept that way. When cereal went stale or no one wanted the crumbs at the bottom of the box, old cooks had a better plan. They baked with it. Cornflakes, bran flakes, even puffed rice were crushed and mixed into muffins, meatloaf, and casseroles. The cereal added texture, absorbed flavor, and helped stretch the main ingredients. In a meatloaf, it soaked up fat and gave it body. In muffins, it acted like flour, turning leftovers into something golden and crisp around the edges. Nothing got tossed. Every scrap had a second life, especially if it saved a little money on flour or breadcrumbs. Grocery stores never advertised this trick because using what you already had meant you were not buying more. But mothers and grandmothers knew better. They turned stale cereal into something warm and filling. You might not even notice it was there, and that was the point. This was cooking with your eyes open and your pantry nearly empty. No fancy boxes, no artificial flavors, just quiet thrift, baked right into dinner. Cleaning cast iron used to be a lesson passed from one generation to the next, and salt was the teacher. No soap, no scouring pads, just coarse salt and a towel. You poured salt into the warm pan and used it like a scrubber, rubbing away the cooked-on bits without removing the seasoning. It left the skillet smooth, clean, and ready for tomorrow's meal. This method kept the pan's hard-earned coating intact, something that took weeks or months to build. Every cook had their own cast iron rules, but salt was nearly universal. It worked, it was cheap, and it was better than anything sold in stores. Today, entire aisles are filled with specialty cleaning products, but this trick came from a time when kitchens relied on know-how, not chemicals. Supermarkets would rather sell you a $10 bottle than remind you that a handful of salt will do the same job. But this was cooking rooted in care, preserving your tools the same way you preserved your food. And that skillet? It just kept getting better with age. Long before the mason jar became a Pinterest trend, people used whatever they had, like old coffee cans, for pickling. Those sturdy metal containers with snap-on lids were perfect for storing quick fridge pickles. You packed them with sliced cucumbers, onions, or green beans, poured in vinegar, water, sugar, and spices, and tucked the whole thing into the fridge or cellar. No need to process or boil. These were not long-term preserves. They were crisp, sharp, and ready in a day or two. It was a fast, no-fuss way to stretch fresh produce a little further. Coffee cans were everywhere, and they were built to last. When the jar shortage hit during wartime, this method took off even more. People got creative because they had to. Grocery stores today will sell you all the gadgets and kits, but this trick worked with what was already in the house. It was quiet ingenuity, saving jars for real canning and letting the coffee tin carry the weight for everyday needs. The pickles were tart, crunchy, and often made with love. And the can? It just kept going. Using sweetened condensed milk as frosting was not just clever, it was kind of brilliant. Back when butter was rationed or too expensive, the sticky canned milk offered a sweet and creamy shortcut that worked on cakes, cookies, and even quick breads. You could thin it with a little lemon juice, cocoa powder, or vanilla and whip it until smooth. It was pourable, spreadable, and needed no refrigeration. Best of all, it tasted rich and indulgent without needing butter or powdered sugar. Some versions even used peanut butter or crushed fruit mixed in. Kids loved it, and mothers appreciated how far one could go. It was frosting without the fuss, and it made homemade cakes feel like something special. Grocery stores would eventually fill their shelves with canned frostings, but this trick came first. It was taught in kitchens where you made do, got creative, and still pulled off dessert. No mixers, no frills. Just a can, a spoon, and a little faith in the process. Mock foods were some of the most creative tricks to ever come out of a humble kitchen. These were recipes made to look and taste like the real thing, without using any of the expensive ingredients. Mock apple pie was one of the most famous, made with Ritz crackers, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice instead of apples. It sounds odd, but once baked, it fooled even the sharpest tongue. There was mock duck made from seasoned wheat gluten, shaped and browned to mimic roasted meat. Mock sausages were mashed beans with spices, shaped and pan-fried. These ideas were born during rationing, when people could not get their hands on sugar, meat, or fresh produce. Instead of going without, they got inventive. These mock dishes were not just substitutions, they were proud declarations that dinner was still happening. Grocery stores today sell imitation foods, but they lack the honesty and ingenuity of these original versions. This was not factory deception. It was resourcefulness, straight from a home cook doing their best. Drying bread in the oven for dressing was the kind of slow step that made fast meals possible later. You took old slices, cubed them up, and spread them on a tray to bake low and slow until they were dry to the touch. No oil, no seasoning, just time and heat. These bread cubes would go into jars or tins and wait patiently until needed. On busy nights or holidays, they were pulled out, mixed with broth and herbs, and baked into stuffing or used to stretch meatloaf. You did not need a box mix or plastic bag, just your own stale bread, carefully dried and saved. It made every scrap feel like it had a purpose. This trick was about thinking ahead, and it helped families cook bigger, heartier meals without spending extra. Grocery stores later packaged stuffing mix in shiny bags and labeled it convenient. But the original version sat on pantry shelves long before that, homemade, quiet, and just as good. Wrapping dough in newspaper may not pass modern food safety rules, but it worked just fine for generations. When plastic wrap was not yet in every drawer, people reached for what they had. Pages from the daily paper, often dusted with flour or lightly buttered. You folded it over the dough and set the bundle in a cool corner, the icebox, or even outside in the winter air. It kept the dough firm and the butter cold, which was all that mattered. This trick helped with pie crusts, cookie dough, or anything that needed resting before baking. It was not pretty, but it did the job, and it cost nothing. You used what you read that morning to bake what you would eat that night. Grocery stores would never tell you this was once normal. After all, a roll of plastic wrap makes more profit than an old newspaper ever could. But the homes that did this were not behind the times. They were just ahead of the waste. Baking whole cloves in a dish inside the oven did more than scent the kitchen. It calmed the whole house. You did not need candles or sprays, just a few tablespoons of cloves, sometimes mixed with cinnamon sticks or orange peels, placed in an oven-safe dish and warmed on low heat. As the oven warmed the spices, the aroma would drift into every corner. It was rich, warm, and far more comforting than anything store-bought. This trick was often used before company came over, during the holidays, or just to lift a heavy mood. For families living through lean times, scent mattered more than people think. It made a plain house feel full, even when the pantry was not. And it masked the smell of stronger meals like cabbage, salt pork, or liver. Supermarkets now sell air fresheners that try to imitate this very thing, but they miss the warmth. Back then, a good-smelling house came from what you cooked, not what you sprayed. Melting leftover candy into glaze was one of those sweet tricks no one talked about, but everyone did. Bits of peppermint sticks, butterscotch discs, or marshmallows were tossed into a saucepan with a splash of milk or butter and stirred until smooth. The result was a sticky, shiny glaze that coated cookies, cakes, or even sliced apples. It worked especially well after holidays when candy seemed to multiply, and families wanted to use up every bit. Even burnt or chipped pieces had a second life. This glaze made even the most basic cake feel festive and fun. It was part treat, part thrift, and all heart. Grocery stores never taught people how to repurpose old sweets because selling more was the goal. But back then, no sugar went to waste. This glaze was not just about saving money. It was about making joy stretch a little further. Poking cakes with forks and pouring syrup over the top was not a gimmick. It was a rescue mission. Sometimes a cake came out too dry, or the sugar ratio was off, or the oven ran a little hot. But instead of throwing it away, you saved it. A simple syrup of water and sugar, maybe with a splash of lemon or a dash of cinnamon, was poured into the holes and soaked deep into the crumb. What came out was moist, flavorful, and better than it had started. Long before boxed poke cakes became trendy, this was just what smart bakers did. No one called it anything special. It was just part of knowing your way around the kitchen. This trick gave second chances to cakes that otherwise would not get eaten. Grocery shelves now sell syrups and mixes for the same effect, but the original was simpler, cheaper, and made with intention. Soap slivers were not thrown away. They were wrapped in cheesecloth, tied off tight, and used to scrub greasy pans and dishes. The small pieces, too small to hold on their own, created a foamy pouch that worked just as well as a fresh bar. Hung by the sink, it was always within reach, soft on hands, tough on grease. This was before liquid dish soaps took over, when kitchens ran on simple routines and clever workarounds. The pouch could be used over and over until the last bubble was gone. For people watching every penny, it made perfect sense. Even a scrap of soap had value. Supermarkets eventually replaced this trick with brightly colored bottles and branded sponges, but the results were not always better, just more expensive. This was old-school efficiency, made from leftovers, tied up in cloth, and used with pride. Cereal box liners used to have a second life long after the cereal was gone. The waxy paper inside those cardboard boxes was peeled out, wiped clean, and folded for reuse. It lined cake pans, wrapped sandwiches, and separated burger patties in the freezer. Some families used it to roll out pie crusts or knead bread. Others used it to cover dishes or press into the corners of a butter mold. It was sturdy, food-safe, and free. Long before wax paper came on a roll, this was how you managed in the kitchen without waste. The plastic revolution made us forget how versatile a cereal box could be. Grocery stores now sell entire boxes of waxed sheets. But back then, one cereal liner could do the job just as well. It was reused by instinct, and it made every meal feel just a little more thoughtful. Sifting ash over vegetables might sound strange, but it worked better than you would think. After cooking over a fire or wood stove, the fine gray ash was gathered, cooled, and sprinkled lightly on cabbage, lettuce, and other leafy greens growing in the garden. It acted as a natural pest repellent, keeping away slugs and worms without chemicals. Plus, the ash added minerals to the soil. This was especially helpful when store-bought pest control was too pricey or simply unavailable. You learned to use what was around, and if you cooked with fire, ash was always part of the deal. Today, the idea of putting ash in your garden feels foreign. But back then, it was second nature, an example of how cooking and gardening were deeply connected. Grocery stores do not benefit when you grow your own food, and they definitely do not mention tricks like this. But for families trying to stretch both meals and dollars, this method meant stronger crops and fewer wasted greens. When coffee was too expensive or simply gone, people turned to roasted grains or dandelion root to fill the gap. Barley, rye, chicory, and even ground-up dandelion roots were toasted dark and brewed like coffee. It was not the same, but it had depth, warmth, and the comforting bitterness that made mornings feel normal. Soldiers, farmers, and city workers alike relied on this homemade brew. It was cheap, accessible, and surprisingly good once you got used to it. Chicory especially became a favorite in southern kitchens, and dandelion root was popular in rural areas where it could be foraged for free. Grocery stores never promoted these alternatives, even though they helped people get by for decades. Why sell you a substitute when they could sell you the real thing? But for those who knew the trick, it was more than just a replacement. It was independence in a cup. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Another thing that people always did was prepare their own homemade snacks. People would make granola bars at home or bake their own little potato chips and corn chips, and it was actually such a nice thing to do because you wouldn't have to take out so much money for literally just 2 or 3 bites of a snack. Plus, these days, snacks cost as much as an outside meal from a restaurant does. It's actually a little insane, you know? Do you know what a jar of Nutella costs nowadays? Isn't it so much easier to just bake some cookies at home and call it a day? Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, you got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. One of the easiest things to do during the Depression to just save a bit more extra cash was planning your meals ahead. If you knew the kind of schedule you were following and what you were working with, then you wouldn't need to be worrying about what to eat, when to eat, and how much to eat. You might be thinking this is a little overboard to start with, but during the Depression, it really was that deep. Luckily, we don't need to carry that same meticulous style of planning and intensity with how things are today. While they're still pretty bad, at least we aren't talking 1930s bad. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter, until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading. And once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Back during the Depression, what people used to do was use their backyards and any fertile soil they found to grow their own vegetables. I'm talking about basic crops like potatoes, corn, celery, onions, garlic, stuff like that. It was actually really genius though, and to be honest, as affordable as the farmers' markets can be sometimes, I'm still not really sure why we ever stopped doing that. Don't you think it would save us so much on groceries? Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Another big thing that people would always do: repurposing furniture. Seriously, there was nothing like that. You could give old furniture an entirely new vibe with just a bit of paint here and there, some polish, a good dusting, and some fabric. People during the Depression went into their creative hobbies as much as they could, like sewing, crocheting, woodwork, carpentry, and stuff like that. It meant that they learned their way around the rusty and dusty furniture that they were so used to seeing in their homes and knew how to put some life back into it. Instead of going to IKEA and wasting yet another quarter of your paycheck on goods you don't need, you could just do this. Dry mustard rubs were more than just a way to flavor meat. They were a quiet method of preservation long before refrigerators took over. A generous dusting of dry mustard, often mixed with salt, pepper, and a few pantry spices, was rubbed deep into cuts of pork, beef, or even game. The mix helped dry the surface, seal in juices, and gave the meat a subtle bite that came alive once cooked. These rubs worked especially well when meat had to be kept cool in a cellar or icebox and used over several days. For families who could not afford to let anything spoil, it was a little layer of safety and a whole lot of flavor. As the meat rested, The mustard acted like a protective barrier, especially in roasts or loins. When you finally cooked it, that seasoning had sunk in all the way through. Some even used mustard rubs before curing or smoking. These days, we rarely think about spices as preservers. We expect refrigeration to do the work. But back then, a tin of mustard powder was one of the most useful things in the pantry. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, but this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Rendered bacon grease was one of those things every household in the 1930s held on to like it was gold. When you could not afford fresh butter or oil, the fat left over from breakfast bacon became your miracle ingredient. After the skillet cooled, people would scrape the drippings into jars and stash them away for everything: beans, biscuits, gravy, cornbread, even cooked vegetables. It was smoky, salty, and rich, and it turned even plain cabbage or boiled potatoes into something comforting. If you were lucky enough to have some cracklings left in the mix, all the better. Bacon itself was a luxury, but the grease stretched that flavor over a dozen meals. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat in the pan. Families would pass these jars down week to week like heirlooms, and it was not uncommon for a mother to teach her child exactly when the grease was good and when it had gone off. It kept things edible, and in a lot of homes, it kept the whole meal together. It is not just a trick. It was a survival tactic that added flavor when seasoning was a distant dream. A spoonful of bacon grease could mean the difference between bland and bearable. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up: breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give. Homemade noodles made from just flour and water were a Depression staple that turned bare cupboards into something hearty. No eggs, no fancy tools, just a rolling pin, a knife, and some determination. Families would mix flour with water until it formed a stiff dough, then roll it thin and cut it into strips or shapes. The noodles were left to dry or boiled right away and dropped into soups, stews, or even just salted water. They soaked up flavor like a sponge, which was perfect when you had more broth than solids. Making noodles became a family affair, with children helping to roll and cut on floured tables. Sometimes people hung them over chairs or laid them out on dish towels to dry. It was messy work, but it filled time and bellies alike. When store-bought pasta was out of the question, these homemade versions stepped in proudly. They had chew, they had bite, and they gave even the thinnest broth some heft. It was food you made from almost nothing, and that always meant something. Soda pop in cake batter sounds like a kid's prank, but for decades it was a real kitchen trick, and one that actually worked. When families were short on eggs, butter, or milk, they found that a can of cola or lemon-lime soda added not just sweetness, but airiness to boxed cake mixes. The bubbles acted like a leavening agent, giving the batter a lift and a fluffiness that surprised even skeptical bakers. Lemon-lime soda went into yellow cakes and cupcakes, while cola paired beautifully with chocolate. The result was a moist, tender crumb that needed no buttercream to be good. Sometimes people would even mix flavored gelatin powder into the batter to amp up the color and make it match the soda. Bright pink for strawberry soda, green for lime, orange for, well, orange. It was part dessert, part science experiment, and always a hit at potlucks and school parties. You would find versions of this in cookbooks with titles like Fun with Cake Mixes or Desserts for a Crowd. Even today, some bakers swear it is the fastest way to get a light, fluffy cake without worrying about what is in the fridge. And they are not wrong. Corncob broth for soups was one of those recipes that showed how deep American resourcefulness really went. After eating fresh corn, you did not toss the cobs. You simmered them. A big pot of water, a few bare cobs, maybe some onion or pepper if you had it. The cobs still held sweetness and starch, which thickened the broth and gave it a soft, buttery flavor. It became the perfect base for chowders, bean stews, or simple vegetable soups. Some people even froze the used cobs for winter cooking. Nothing was wasted. This trick worked especially well in the South and Midwest, where corn was king. It made your kitchen smell like summer, even in January. These days, most people would never think to keep a cob after the kernels are gone. But for those who remember, it was like getting a second meal for free. Cabbage leaf meat preservers were the poor man's parchment paper. When you had a small cut of meat and needed it to stay moist, you wrapped it in cabbage leaves. The leaves kept the juices in, added a faint sweetness, and softened up into something you could eat alongside the roast. You could bake it, steam it, or even tuck it into a skillet with a lid. The trick worked with ground meat, too. Stuffed cabbage rolls were just a natural evolution. It was popular among Eastern European immigrants, but caught on fast across rural America. The cabbage acted like a seal, but it was edible, cheap, and always around. People grew cabbage in their gardens and used every bit of it. Today, we use foil or fancy bags to lock in moisture, but back then, a cabbage leaf did the job just fine. Crumbled biscuit breakfast bowls were a warm and simple way to start a cold morning when you had almost nothing left. The trick was to take yesterday's biscuits, already hard or going stale, break them into pieces and pour over hot milk. Add a pinch of sugar, maybe a bit of cinnamon or molasses, and let the mixture soak until the biscuit softened. What you got was something between a porridge and a bread pudding. It was not fancy, but it was filling, warm, and easy on the stomach. In the 1930s, breakfast was often made from leftovers, and this one was a favorite among both children and adults. The milk made it feel rich. The sugar gave it a sweet lift. And the biscuit? That was just doing its job one more time before being truly done. It was a gentle way to begin the day, especially when the day ahead promised to be anything but gentle. This bowl of sweet, soggy comfort was more than a meal. It was a quiet promise that even the smallest things could be made useful again. Potato chip casserole topping was one of those strange little tricks that somehow made dinner feel like a treat. Back in the day, people did not have access to fancy breadcrumbs or crunchy imported cheeses, and boxed mixes were still a novelty. But they almost always had a bag of plain potato chips sitting around, maybe a little stale, maybe half-eaten, maybe on sale. So when it came time to top a casserole, instead of breadcrumbs or fried onions, cooks reached for that crinkled bag, crushed it up in their hands, and sprinkled the pieces across the top. Into the oven it went, and out came something golden, salty, and unexpectedly satisfying. That simple potato chip crust made otherwise bland casseroles feel indulgent, and the trick was proudly passed down in community cookbooks, church bulletins, and lunchroom chatter. It was cheap, it was crunchy, and best of all, it used something people already had. There were even recipes that told you to mix the crushed chips with melted margarine or powdered cheese before baking, because if you were going to commit to a topping, you might as well go all in. There is just something so right about a casserole with a potato chip crown. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool. And for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Tomato aspic salad was a Depression-era invention that tried its best to look fancy when there was nothing in the pantry but pantry itself. It was made by dissolving gelatin in hot tomato juice, then mixing in chopped onions, celery, vinegar, and sometimes even shredded carrots if you had them. Once it was poured into a mold or a shallow dish and chilled, it firmed up into something like a savory jelly. It sounds odd to us now, but back in the 1930s, it was considered a creative way to stretch tomatoes and vegetables into a salad-like side dish. It was cold, tangy, and often served at community meals or church suppers when no one could afford fresh produce. Housewives took pride in slicing it clean and presenting it on a bed of wilted lettuce or cabbage leaves. It looked elegant in its strange little way, like a meal trying to be better than it was. Some topped it with a spoonful of mayonnaise or cottage cheese to add richness, though most just served it plain. Tomato aspic may not have been anyone's favorite dish, but it was admired for how little it took to make something that felt proper. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. If these old tricks stirred a memory or sparked an idea, leave a comment, like the video, and hit subscribe to keep the wisdom cooking.